everything they've done. I especially want to thank our presenters for bringing and sharing their wonderful knowledge set and experience to the forefront so that we can all go home from this conference with ideas and feeling invigorated and feeling connected to one another again. So I want to thank you for all of that work and time this had. I also want to invite all of you that are here at the completion of this conference to take the swag bags home with you, as many as you need, to share with your colleagues who attended virtually. So please, your teammates and your office mates and your clients and the people that you serve. So there's goodies in those swag bags. So please make sure you take them home. So with all of that and the housekeeping and the recognition and acknowledgement of the team that put this together, I would like to introduce our featured speaker. So I have to have her bio in front of me because I was trying to study this ahead of time, and there are so many impressive experiences that she's bringing forward that I couldn't cover them all. So bear with me. Do a highlight of the level of skill that we're bringing forward with Dr. Betsy Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson is a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. So what a great speaker to culminate this wonderful event. She is a faculty research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research, a visiting associate professor of economics at the University of Sydney. She's a research fellow at the Center for Economics of Policy Research. There are so many amazing things. She served as an advisor on the Council of Economic Advisors from 2013 to 2015, where she advised President Barack Obama on social policy, labor market, and trade issues. This is very timely and a wealth of experience that she's bringing forward. She served as a chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor from 2010 to 2011. So we're bringing all of these avenues together, the workforce trends, the labor market, the economics that's driving, and what a timely conversation now. She's held previous positions at Princeton University, the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School, and she's published widely in leading economic journals about the labor market and the impact of public policies on the outcomes for families as they adjust to this changing labor market. So we're talking about the future of work. We're looking at where our clients and our students need to land for sustainable wages and sustainable careers and career pathways. So what a wonderful experience to wrap up all of this great knowledge by bringing in a leading national and international expert in the world of policy and economics. I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Betsy Stevenson and learn from her wonderful presentation today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. I'm excited today to be able to talk to you about what I call an imperfect labor market recovery. And I'm certain that you've heard lots of media coverage of this. And the truth is that around the globe, particularly when we're looking at sort of advanced economies, Europe, Canada, Australia, and the United States, there's a real puzzle out there of why GDP recovered so much faster than the labor market, why there are so many vacancies, job openings, a record number of job openings, and yet we haven't brought all the workers back. So I want to walk you through this imperfect labor market recovery so we can dive into it and understand a little bit at a deeper level what's going on. And in order to do that, we have to take a look at what I call a tale of two sectors, the service sector versus the goods producing sector. And we're going to spend more time on that when I get there. But I always like to remind people that now in the United States, or prior to the pandemic and now, the United States is mostly a service sector economy. So 80 to 85% of our private sector jobs are in the service sector. And they run the spectrum of very jobs that take very minimal training and skills to jobs that take a large amount of both formal and informal training. And then we're going to turn to looking at increased churn and upheaval in the labor market and the kinds new ways of working, preferences, transitions, sort of what's going on there. And I'll end with sort of how I see the labor market and if there's any sort of insights to the future of work. I start with an imperfect labor market recovery. The first thing to note is that GDP has mostly completely recovered. So here you can see that we're well beyond pre-pandemic GDP. And of course, this is inflation adjusted GDP, and we're even pretty close to the 2012 to 2019 trend. So our GDP has not just returned, but it's gone back to where it would have been if we'd never had a pandemic. And I just like that's a remarkable thing, given that the pandemic did pretty big hits on our capabilities. It really slowed down goods being traveling around the globe. It's taken more people resources and more resources to provide a lot of the same goods that we provided before, because we have to take a lot more COVID precautions. So this miraculous recovery in GDP, but our labor force participation rate, the number of people who are willing to work, remains low. And if we just abstract away from who's willing to work and who's out of work and just look at who is at work, employment to population ratio, we see that it's still around 1.5 to 2 percentage points below what the pre-existing was. And it's still clearly around 1 percentage point below its actual pre-pandemic level. So we haven't gotten all the workers. So how big is the gap? You might hear a lot of economists talk about, well, the gap's not that bad, it's pretty small, or others it's bigger. And that's because it ultimately depends on what I call an unknowable counterfactual, which is just what would have happened without the pandemic. We're never going to know for sure what would have happened in a parallel universe where we hadn't had the pandemic. But we can take a look at different groups of people to see what was going on with them prior to the pandemic, what would have been reasonable to think about might have happened without the pandemic, and then sort of understand maybe how big of a gap we currently have. So the first thing I want to do is focus on women, because women got hit the hardest in this pandemic, and we have seen a lot of concern about whether women will fully recover. I then want to talk about older workers. I want to talk about immigrants, and then we'll talk about men, and that will lead us into discussing the tale of two sectors. So the labor force participation in the United States had declined from 2000 to 2015 after really 30 years of incredibly rapid growth. Right, so women's labor force participation rose enormously the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and it sort of hit the peak in 1999. And then it came down with the 2001 recession and never fully recovered. It was sort of chugging along. And then we got hit by 2008 recession. And it was really got whacked with the 2008 recession. And then in 2015, there was a turning point where it was rapid growth in prime age female labor force participation that continued straight February 2020. Women had become the majority of holders of non-farm payrolls. They had their highest labor force participation they'd ever had. Would this kind of growth have continued and out? And I think that's one of the real fundamental questions. I want to show you the data, and then I'll come to those life patterns. What you can see here is what I was just sort of telling you. We had strong growth in the 90s that had followed strong growth in the 80s, a peak, and then a coming down with that recession in 2001, 2002, and a very slow recovery before a very low fall due to the 2008 recession. And then you see that very strong recovery between 2015 and 2019. And obviously a big hit with 2020, haven't fully recovered. Now, what the question is, should women's labor force participation recover to 2018? That's what some economists think. They think, well, it was really 2090, maybe unusually high. Or should it recover to 2019? or should it recover to the 2015 to 19 trend? It may seem like this is a question in the weeds, but it's actually at the heart of underthink with have returned to a sort of steady state labor force participation, because they're already back to 2018 and early 2019 levels, but they're 1.1 percentage points below the 2015 to 2019 trend. And that is a very large gap. So is the gap large? Well, it depends on whether you think that trend would have continued. One thing to think about as we go through this talk is one reason why we might have expected the trend to have continued, and I'll just jump back to my slides, is women's life pattern really changed a lot compared to generations, when it comes to moms. So moms, women with kids under the age of 18 in the house, had their highest historical labor force participation in 2010, and those were older in 2020 than at any other time in history. On average, the average age of a mom of, say, a 5-year-old was older in 2020 than in any previous year. But here's the thing a lot of people don't realize. Those in the 2020, mothers in the 2020 pandemic were more likely to be mothers of that cohort. So if we take a 45-year-old woman in the 2008 recession and we look at 45 in the 2020 recession, those 45-year-old women in the 2020 recession were more likely to have ever been a mom, had more kids on average, and had younger kids at home because it had their kids at older ages. So you saw something very different in moms in the 2020 recession. They had more work experience and they had more education. And that drove a lot of this feeling of what people call like the primal scream of moms. So I promise we're going to come back and talk more about parenting, but let's just lay the groundwork with what's going on with these different cohorts. So let's turn to older workers. Among older workers, labor force participation rose from the mid-90s, sort of peaking in 2012 and staying largely flat, which is quite remarkable given that the population continued to age. So this is the labor force participation of people 55 plus. If you actually looked at this, say, conditional on age, would have continued to go up, right? Because somebody over the age of 55 on average, as the boomers were aging, was a little bit older, say 15 than they had been in, say, 2010. And what had happened, we see this big upward rise through much of the 90s and 2000s in older workers. Force participation is not an income problem. I was in the Obama administration as chief economist. We spent a lot of time in that recession trying to figure out if the older workers who were working more were doing so because they were broke. And the reality was it wasn't those workers who were working more. It were workers with more education. The reason this is relevant today is what's led older people to work more is work became more pleasant, easier to do, and less risk to their health. Well, what happened with the pandemic? Work became more of a risk to their health. It became less pleasant for a lot of jobs where you might be interacting with people who became more aggressive, or you might be interacting with people where you might get sick. Their own health had got worse because so many of them did get COVID. And all of that has pushed their labor force participation down. I think it's going to be very, very hard to recover this labor force participation rate of older men and women. Another place where workers is foreign, working age foreign born population. So here I'm showing you a chart that shows you the foreign born population in millions between 2010 and 2022. And what you can see is that started to decline around 2019. So this isn't all about the pandemic. Part of this is due to earlier immigration policy changes, but we see this decline in the working age population. And this gives us, in 2022, roughly a 2 million shortfall relative to the trend. So in industries where you see labor market tightness, part of the issue missing these immigrant workers. And in fact, down in this graph, where what we see is the unfilled jobs is higher in industries where there's a higher foreign-born share back in 2019. So look at food, hospitality, very high rate of unfilled jobs, very high rate of foreign-born workers prior to the pandemic. So the last cohort I want to examine is men. And what we see men is that male labor force participation has been trending down for half a century. So I'm not showing you half a century here, but if you go back, if I graphed all the way actually back to 1950, and I focused called prime age men, 25 to 54, what you see is just a steady but slight decline in labor force participation. So, 25 to 54-year-old men are of the ages that we sort of expect to be in the labor force. And what you can see is today, or around 2015, it sort of hit a low of around 87%. Now, if you go take this all the way back from 1990, you get numbers around 98%. In 1990, it had fallen to about 94%. And you can just see this sort of steady decline, but it's not, I should say it's not a steady decline. What we see is that in a recession, it speeds up the decline, like you see in the 2008 recession, and then it tends to flatten out coming out of the recession. We don't get a lot of growth coming out of recessions for men. Typically, in 2015, it's like when we started to see that turnaround and we started pulling a little bit more men into the labor force. Nowhere near at quite the rapid rate as women, but we do see an upward trend from 2015 to 2019. And if we were to fit that trend for men, you would see the 1 percentage point gap in male labor force participation compared to that 2015 to 2019 trend. Currently, this is the data as of just March of 2022. So the data that was released a few weeks ago. But like women, they're fully recovered to their sort of 2018, 2019 rates. So the bottom line is, come prime age non-immigrant workers in the United States, has everybody returned to work? Well, the answer to that question ultimately depends on whether we're trying to return them to a very unusual and rapid 2015 to 2019 trend or not. But it is clear that we've lost older workers and we've lost immigrant workers. So let's talk a little bit about this male-female difference, because it turns out really important for understanding why this recession and recovery is playing out so differently and what might be the permanent effects. So if you look at normal reasons, this is the employment of men relative to pre-recession peak and the employment of women relative to the pre-recession peak. And what you see is how many people lose jobs, and then how many months does it take for them to not trend, but just holding the number of jobs they'd held for. What you see very clearly is, aside from the black line, which is the 2020 recession, in every other recession, women barely lose jobs and men lose a lot of jobs. The 2007-2009 recession was one of the first recessions where women lost very many jobs at all. And even then, it was only about 40% of what men experienced. You could see a decline in male employment at its worst being 8%, and for women at its worst being like 3.5 to 4, and women's recovered a little bit faster than men. In fact, it's not just that women don't lose jobs, but their continued job growth is actually what leads our recoveries. So if we were waiting for men to recover all their jobs, our recoveries would typically take a lot longer. In every past recession, we considered ourselves fully recovered long before men were fully recovered, because women had such rapid job growth. So why do women typically have such rapid job growth, and why do they not get hit by recessions? Well, the reason is that recessions tend to hit the goods producing sector, and women tend to work in the service providing sector. And over time, our economy has shifted quite dramatically. You often hear the policymakers want to talk about bringing back manufacturing jobs or goods producing jobs to the United States. And I'm not commenting on whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but I want to put the magnitudes in place for you. Between 1970 and the start of the pandemic in February of 2020, the US had lost 2 million jobs in the goods producing sector. So you can sort of barely see it on this graph. We had about 2 million fewer jobs in the goods producing sector in February of 2020 compared to January of 1970. And what you see, I think probably quite easily, is in that same time period, that same 50-year period where we lost 2 million goods producing jobs, we gained 74 million service providers. So it's been the broad trend for 50 years, but you even focus in on this last sort of 8-10 years prior to the pandemic, you see how sharp the growth in the service sector jobs were compared to very shallow growth in the goods producing jobs. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had not returned all the way back to where we were prior to the start of the 2008 recession in the goods producing sector. But look at how much we had soared in the providing sector. So why does this matter? Why is this so important? Well, women working mostly in the providing sector, as we recover from a recession, normally happens is a surge in service sector jobs, and women go into those jobs. And we also don't lose any jobs typically in the service sector in a recession as we do in the goods producing sector. You can see many of these recessions, there's barely a dip in the service sector at all in the recession. 2008 was a notable exception. And then, of course, the pandemic-based recession hit the service sector the hardest. And that really changes how we recover from it and who got hurt by it. In February 2020, employment in the goods producing sector was nearly 1 million jobs below December 2007, while the employment in the service sector had grown by 14.5 million jobs. And yet in 2020, employment in the goods producing sector fell by 12%. Employment in the service sector fell by 17%. Given the difference in the sizes of the sectors, that is millions of more jobs in the service sector than in the goods sector. Tens of millions more jobs really is the difference in these two sectors. What are we trying to recover to in the service sector? Well, the service sector has been our source of growth. Here we see the trend from 2010 to 2020. We have not recovered back where we were in 2019, which would have been about 108 million service sector jobs. We're maybe about 1 million below right now, but are we trying to get back to that trend? That puts us more than 5 million workers away from back on our pre-existing trend line. Normally a recession just doesn't impact education and health services at all. So here I'm showing you total employees in education and health services, and you can see that women are the vast majority of the sector. Nearly 80% of the employees are women, and you don't see any dip downs in any recession until we get to the 2020 recession. We have yet to add back all the workers in education and health services, and this sector disproportionately impacts women because 1 in 4 women in the economy that are working work in private sector education and health services. I'm going to talk a little bit about this at the end, but I just want to highlight one of my big concerns has been the decline in enrollment in vocational programs and community colleges. They're often the source of training for the what we might think of as the mid or lower skill jobs in education and health services. Again, we could think about this relative to trend. Growth in education and health services has been as strong as growth in services overall, or even a little bit stronger. And so we are missing around 1.2 million jobs in this particular sector. And this feels like a sector where we're going to need to get these jobs back. We're going to need to return. Maybe not quickly. Maybe there was some streamlining that came around due to telemedicine or due to other ways in which the service sector might, particularly the education and health service sector, might have tried to economize and figure out how to do more with less people. But ultimately, most of this sector involves people working with people. And we can really see where this sector, the subsectors within here that are suffering the most. Nursing care facility employment was already starting to trend down and did a nosedive in the wake of the pandemic, and it hasn't really begun to recover at all. I would only call this tip up much of a recovery, and this is really just in 2022. Child daycare services is still down more than %. And here you can see that the trend up in childcare workers 2015 to 2020 coincided with the strong growth in both male and female labor force participation. And here I actually just plot that for you so you see how much childcare, the growth care workers paralleled the growth in female labor force participation. Let's take one other sector in the service sector, leisure and hospitality. We lost half the jobs in leisure and hospitality, and actually finding workers, creating those jobs is not going to be an overnight process. This has actually been the sector that's seen the strongest growth since April, adding this most steadily adding jobs. And it may be that we are on track to getting back the 1.4 million workers. Take some time, but it may also be that you can see this growth start flattening, that it takes us quite a long time before we get back to trend, and that the new trend may have permanently flattened out a little bit. But I think it's important to realize when we look at leisure and hospitality flattened out, we don't actually have all the demand back yet. This is some really interesting data from Morning Consult called Tracking the Return to Normal. And I've been following this along for the past 2 years because what it shows is that when the virus waxes and wanes, it impacts people's comfort dining out. So first of all, the hit to restaurants was definitely not at all stay-at-home orders, not all stay-at-home orders. A lot of it had to do with the fact that people just weren't comfortable. If you go back to May of 2020, 4 out of 5 people, 80% of people said they were not comfortable going to a restaurant. That doubled by July to 40%. And that's probably not surprising. But then you saw, it sort of stay at 40% for some time until people started getting vaccinated. And we saw a huge surge in the rise, going up to about 2/3 of people. And now you can see it sort of waxing and waning. We sort of see a local peak in July of 2021, and then the Delta variant hits and we ride that wave down. And then they start getting comfortable again. And then we see the Omicron wave hit. And now people have started getting more comfortable. But you still have at least 1 in 5 and still roughly 1 in 4 people who are not yet comfortable going to a restaurant. You can do this. Look at those same patterns. You see it here in people's comfort going on a vacation. A lot of people are thinking that we're going to have huge pricings for vacations this summer. And that's definitely if we start to see a big surge, because we still have, again, 1/3 of people not comfortable. Get that back up to say 90% of people comfortable. It could be a big increase in demand, and that increase in demand requires hiring more people. And so one of the questions will be, can the industry respond quickly enough by hiring enough people? Are there enough trained workers? The airline industry lost a lot of certified pilots who either didn't keep their license up or decided to retire, or new pilots simply weren't trained. And I think we're going to see these kind of shortages impact over the next 3 years. So that's the tale of two sectors. Let's turn to thinking about the increased churn and upheaval. So we have a record number of job openings. This is really unprecedented. This data only goes back to 2000. Because I am old, I've worked with data back in the 90s and in the 80s, what was called the Help Wanted Index, when they actually measured based on help wanted pages in the newspaper. These job openings are measured at a point in time. So they don't mean that these are jobs people can't fill. It's just how many jobs there are possible right now. And what we see is there are roughly 11.5 million jobs open. That's a lot of openings. That's a lot of opportunities for workers. That's a lot of resources that employers have to put into trying to interview and find people. And all those opportunities are creating opportunities for people to find better jobs and quit. So we also have record quits now. With lots of people, they're not leaving the labor force necessarily. In fact, most of them aren't, mostly moving to other jobs. The number of people who want a job now actually remains elevated, people not in the labor force. So if we were to count the people who are outside the labor force but claim they want a job now among the unemployed, this would raise the unemployment rate by roughly a point relative to where it would have been in 2019 because of that extra elevated. If we counted them all, it would be raising the unemployment rate by 4 or 5 percentage points, right? Have roughly sort of 5.5 million people who are outside the labor force who say they would like to have a job now. Back in 2019, that number was sort of closer to 4.5 or 5 million. So why all these job changes? Well, one is that there's been a reduction in fear and uncertainty. So people who sort of stood still during the early stages of the pandemic are really wanting to make some kind of changes. There's just been really big shakeup about jobs. So we could think about it as people had time to reflect on changing values and priorities, but it's also the jobs themselves have changed. So one way to think about this is, used to be maybe you were choosing between two jobs, one that required in-person work because the nature of the job was a little bit face-to-face, customer service facing, and the other business job, but you also had to be in the office. Well, and you might have chosen the one where you had to be in person, interacting with people, and that job still requires that you're in person. But now that other job no longer requires it. So people's preferences are going to cause a lot of shifting because the nature of the job has changed. I also think there's a lot of industries where interacting with people, the nature of the job has changed, either because of more risk of a contagious virus or the way people are treating people in those jobs has changed. And then finally, that really big, strong job market, those opportunities create opportunities to make a change. And so if we have a lot of openings, we're going to have a lot of quits. Openings come down, quits will come down. Also is the case that American households acquired $2.6 trillion in excess savings. In 2020, people were afraid to spend. And they didn't spend that excess savings in 2021 either. They started to spend it. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing higher inflation. And that they've started to spend this savings. As that savings spent down, that's going to make people a little bit more connected to their jobs, and I think bring more people in to the labor market. But I'm going to show you something that you might think, wait a minute, is this a left turn? This isn't labor market data. I have spent a lot of my career studying data on just whether people say that they're happy or satisfied with their life, and what does that predict about the economy. And what you can see here is that the pandemic was a shock to unhappiness that was just unprecedented. A shock to a decline in people being happy, a decline in happiness. We barely see, we don't see that kind of movement population wide basically ever. This is like the kind of movement in an individual's happiness you would see if their spouse died or they lost a child. And yet we're seeing that across the population on average. So it's sort of not surprising people are looking for a lot of changes, given that they're not very happy with their lives. So let's take a look at this idea of new ways of working, new preferences, and transition. What are people doing? Pew had this really amazing data very recently that I wanted to share with you on this, which asked people who left jobs, why'd they quit? And you're not going to be surprised to hear that that the primary reason people quit is because the pay is too low, right? Money, money, money. And maybe it's not too low today, but maybe it's looks like it's going to be too low in the future. So it's either the pay is too low right now or there's no opportunities for advancement. But what I think is worth paying attention to is almost as important is whether they felt respected at work. And then we get to childcare issues and workplace flexibility and benefits, the kinds of things that we think are really important for working families that a lot of companies have not been able to adequately provide, and that we don't have as part of the social safety net. Those are the next sort of bucket of things that really drive people to quit. And then there are people who are working too many hours, and there are people working too few hours. The number of people who say they're working too many hours is bigger than we're working too few hours. And I do think there has been this shakeup in terms of how many hours people want to work. But the warning that I give everyone is that when employers try to offer fewer work days, so more paid days off, like a 4-day work week, for instance, they have historically found that employees leave them for jobs that require more work and pay more money. So in order to work less, we're going to get paid less, conditional on working less. If there's some other employer who opens up across town and says, if you work 20% more, I'll pay you 20% more, they're not really giving you a raise. They're just giving you an opportunity to work more and earn for that. And what we find is that it's not a very stable equilibrium for employers to offer less work at that lower wage, because at the end of the day, people go out looking for more pay. And you'll see that very few people quit because of vaccines. Who ended up quitting the most were people with the least income. So lower income workers, 24% quit. Upper income workers, only 11% quit. Some of that's because sort of obvious. People are quitting because the pay's too low. Then the people who are going to quit the most are the people who are paid too low, get the low pay. But it's also about education, right? So high school graduates or people with some college, 1 in 5 quit, compared to people with a bachelor's degree or postgraduate, where you have, roughly 15% quitting. Younger workers quit the most, and that's just fitting their sort of lifestyle pattern. Younger workers quit. That's where they get big wage gains. This has been a great economy for them to be able to do that. And we see a little bit of women quitting more than men, but I wouldn't make too much of that difference. What we do see is, I think the way to read this data is that workers with more education have fewer reasons to quit. So among those who quit, not enough flexibility to choose when to put in hours was a big issue for people with some college or less, much less so than for people with a bachelor's degree. It's a sort of a glass half full, glass half empty thing. It's still 1/3 of college graduates said they quit because they didn't have enough control over their schedule. Essentially, that's what not enough flexibility to choose means. They want control. Workers want control, and they're right now willing to walk to get it. Working too few hours, that is a problem that is, again, much more likely to be experienced by workers with less education. And interestingly, when we dig in by education, we see that the vaccine did make a bigger deal for workers with less education. So what did people get? What were the benefits of quitting? People, not surprisingly, most people who quit are now earning more money. Most people who quit now have more opportunities for advancement. Most people found it's now easier to balance work and family responsibilities. Most people found they had more flexibility to choose, and they had better benefits. So quitting is about moving to opportunity, and that's what we have right now in this economy is a lot of churn with people trying to move towards opportunity. What you hear from employers is getting really competitive. We got to give people all these things they want to hire them. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Sort of depends on whether we end up with workers who are able to deliver what employers need to be able to justify the higher wages and higher benefits. But some of these benefits, like being able to balance work and family responsibilities, come at a very low cost for employers and are highly valued for workers. And what we see is employers who are offering these things are finding it's an easier time for them to hire right now. To step back a little bit, I did my own survey looking specifically at parents and what they experienced. And what I found was that the problem with parents in childcare was a mother's and father's problem. The press focuses on moms, but I want you to know it was mothers and fathers. Mothers were more likely to quit a job than fathers were. But what fathers did was more subtle, but potentially just as costly for their career. They turned down promotions, they changed to more flexible work, they reduced their hours, they paused training or upskilling. So fathers made changes. And in fact, fathers were even slightly less likely than mothers to say they were able to work as usual, given their childcare constraints. So what did that mean for dads? Dads were more likely than moms to say they wanted to work less or pursue a less demanding job. You have nearly, you have more than 40% of dads, about 42% of dads saying they want to work less or pursue a less demanding job. And this matches with other data that shows that dads became more satisfied with the amount of time they got with their kids during the pandemic, and the fact that dads were much less satisfied than moms with the amount of time they got with their kids prior to the pandemic. Remote work is still really common. Many workers prefer it, and many businesses are accommodating. We're right now in this era of businesses trying to get people back into the office. But what the research shows is that if you give workers the ability to work from home some of the time, they're more productive. And workers very much value being in the office. And the way for employers to think about this is to think like an economist. So we want to think about thinking on the margin. So having your employee in the office 1 hour a week, there's a lot of benefit to it, particularly if they coordinate it so it's the same hour everybody else is in. Second hour, maybe there's a lot of benefit there too, but eventually the returns, the benefits to workers being in the office start to decline. By the 40th hour, you're better off having your employee work from home if they were able to work from home well during the pandemic. And so what I think the adjustment is right now is employers trying to figure out, what does a world of work look like where maybe people come in 2 days a week or 3 days a week, and how do they coordinate so that people are overlapping together? Because I can tell you from my own university, going in when nobody else has gone in, there's no point. And right now, I don't know when anybody else is going to go in, so I might as well work from home. So we got to solve that coordination problem so you can get people interacting with each other again. So I want to summarize with our current labor market challenges, including mentioning a couple things I didn't mention. One is that workers are still sicker than normal. So when we look in the data, we ask people who missed work because they were sick. We see millions of people who are missing work each month, more than what we see normally. And that means that we have a lot of people out of work. I think about this though, relative to GDP, we don't really see it in the GDP numbers, which actually might mean letting people stay home when they're sick is cheaper than we thought, because maybe they weren't really that productive when they were going to work sick in the first place. I think people don't really know what return to normal means. And that's some of the things I was just talking about. What does return to normal mean? Inflation is pushing down real wages. And a lot of employers are trying to add compensation that's not just higher wages, but more vacation days, more sick days. Will employees value those enough? Or will they chase the jobs that have fewer days off and higher wages? I think we don't know the answer to that yet. People claim they want to work less, but when push comes to shove, if somebody's offering them $100,000 a year with almost no vacation day, or sorry, with almost no vacation days, and somebody else comes along and offers them $90,000 a year, but they're going to get a lot more vacation days, a tenth, off. So maybe maybe a whole paid month off with sick days and holidays. Which do they choose? Which do they ultimately choose? We've seen a lot, this reduction in older workers. I worry a lot about what that's going to mean for older people's longevity, their life expectancy, their cognitive abilities. Do we need to come up with a plan for these older workers who feel like they've been driven out of the labor force? People continue to face caregiving challenges. Much of the caregiving that was once done in the market has been brought home. So those residential care facilities, they're with fewer employees in them, with fewer of them available, there are older people who need care, adults who need care, who are living at home with family members providing that care uncompensated in a way that may and likely is interfering with their own ability to work. The same thing with childcare. Kids are sent home from school much more frequently now, and you need the flexibility to make sure that there's care. And childcare itself is expensive and less available. People want to work in new industries with more flexibility at home, and we're still sort of sorting all of that out. And the last thing I want to raise, something I mentioned briefly before, is vocational program enrollment has been down. Is there a new worker shortage on the horizon? I think it's one of the biggest risks to the labor market we face right now, and I think it's getting the least attention. And so I wanted to highlight it with you, a group of people who I think are best poised to think about how do we ensure that people have the training they need to be able to take the in-demand jobs of tomorrow. So with that, I will end, and I think we open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Betsy. We're getting up to the mic here.
And then, so can you mute?
So somebody has asked if I can.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
But you can't.
Betsy, can you hear him?
I cannot. No, I don't know what just happened. I couldn't, and it went away.
Betsy, whenever you can hear Andy Lasasso, give us a thumbs up.
Okay, I cannot hear right now.
All right, bear with us just a moment.
I can hear you. I heard the bear with us.
Oh, Dr. Stevenson, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. And then it went away.
Okay, so you can't hear me, but we cannot hear you, so I have to go back and forth. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Stevenson. We have some great questions that came through the Whova app. The first one, before we switch the audio back to you, is has the wage between women and men increased or decreased during the pandemic?
Great. Are you ready to go back to me?
Yes.
Okay. So my the wage gap has decreased, and I think it's really hard to make too much out of that right now, because one of the things that happened with the gender wage gap is, or one of the things that happened is it was the lowest wage women who lost their jobs, and they're the ones who have not come back as fast to the labor market. So what we call that is a compositional effect, right? You're going to see the wage gap drop if you kick out if women who were making minimum wage are the ones who lost their jobs and everybody else is left, right? We don't put zeros in. So the gender wage gap has continued to narrow, and it's certainly it's not. I just pulled it up because I wanted to be able to answer you specifically. It's the same as it was in 2021, but it's better than it was in 2020, and so it's in 2020. The start of 2022 is cents on the dollar, and what we've seen with the gender wage gap, I think that's worth keeping in mind, is that it has been a very much narrowed for younger women, particularly in many big metropolitan areas. And the reason is that women have more education than men. So if we were just doing this based on educational attainment and we were looking at 25-year-old women, they should earn more than men, because college graduates earn more than those without a college degree. So, with the wage gap, the question is always, how should we adjust the wage gap? Should we think about it in terms of industry, occupation, education? I like to think about it more broadly, what's going on with women. And, we still see many instances where women aren't paid the same equal work, and that's against the law. But most instances of the wage gap tend to be more subtle situations, like women turning down promotions because of childcare responsibilities. And that's one reason why we see a very narrow wage gap, unfortunately, in the 20s, that starts to widen in the 30s and becomes like a big yawning gulf in the 40s and 50s for most women.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Stevens. Our next question. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. I hope you don't mind, Camilla. Doctor, in your opinion, will HR investments, including apprenticeships, entrepreneurship, and other forms of work readiness, will those become more available for those who are part of our reentry populations or who have a criminal history, whether it be adult or juvenile?
So I want to say, first of all, I think these kinds of programs are incredibly important, and I think we need to expand them to non-traditional occupations so that we're using those kinds of apprenticeship programs for the service sector, given that's where most of the job growth typically is. I do think that in a tight labor market, what we see is that, people, what we saw in 2019, 2018, 2017 was people with criminal backgrounds, criminal records, becoming more likely to be hired, employers more willing to overlook that. And I think that, that's one of the benefits of a tight labor market. And I really hope that the fact that we have this sort of high inflation coinciding with a tight labor market doesn't give people a bad taste in their mouth for tight labor markets, because they're really important for bringing people back in. But I guess on the direct question about the kinds of programs you're talking about, I think they benefit a lot of people, not just reentry. And I'll tell you, reentry, we use that specifically to refer to people with criminal backgrounds, but there's a broader problem in our labor market, which is that anybody who takes time out of working has a hard time finding their way back to work. And I wish we would think about pathways back to work much more broadly for people, whether you've been work because of a criminal background, or whether you've been out of work to take care of children, or whether you've been out of work due to an illness, or whether you've been out of work due to mental health problems. I mean, certainly a lot of anxiety that I think might be keeping some people out of work right now. So I think we have to have a national approach in thinking about how do we steer people back to work, and when they've worked for a while, and how do we integrate those programs in a way where we're not, sort of isolating different populations, but maybe allowing some of them to come together.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Doctor. Next question. You had touched on this in your presentation, but if you could summarize for us the role that remote work has had on women in the workplace, please.
Ooh, that's a very complicated thing to answer. So in some occupations, women have found remote work to be very equalizing. I gave a talk at the American Bar Association about female lawyers, and a lot of women found that there was less room for bias when everybody was same size square on the Zoom call. And so for a lot of women, for a lot of highly educated women, I think that remote work was an equalizer. I think that remote work has given women flexibility, but I think it also creates a real risk for women that men go back into the office and women stay at home. And if you do that, you bifurcate career paths. And if you bifurcate career paths, and we have one path for men and one path for women, I have no faith that the path for women will be equal to for men. And so I think when that's what we have to figure out. If we're basically allowing people to choose whether they go in or not, whether they're in person in the office or not in person, whether we're allowing people to choose, they're sort of on a track where they work only 40 hours a week, where other people might work 50 or 60 hours a week, you can really get big career differences. And we have a lot of lessons from this, from things like academia, right? And academia, we gave both men and women the right to extend their tenure clocks when they had a child. And the result was fewer women getting tenure and more men getting tenure, because men and women So when we have these kinds of opportunities that, in theory, giving people more time to make tenure or make partner at a law firm because of the child clock, the biological clock, makes a lot of sense. In practice, you have to make sure that you don't create these bifurcated labor markets in which men are able to get ahead. And so I think we don't know the answer yet, but I will say that in general, I hear from both men and women that quality of life is improved when you have more flexibility. And so ultimately, I think it will depend on whether men choose to continue to take advantage of that flexibility, and therefore join women in sort of thinking about work-family balance. What makes me optimistic was the data I showed that said fathers were sort of as committed to getting more time with their kids as moms and willing to make a change. I think if that happens, then work from home and the increased value we've seen in workplace flexibility, I think could end up being revolutionary for women.
Excellent, thank you. We have time for just one more question. The rest of the questions will be answered through the FAQ following the summit. Dr. Stevenson, if you're ready, the last question is, there has been talk about another recession soon. What advice would scenario as it relates to workforce development?
Well, the thing about recessions is, negative shocks. Recessions come out of nowhere. They come from a shock, right? Really got hit hard by the pandemic. That came out of nowhere. The economy was strong. Things were great in January of 2020. Some of us could see the writing on the wall in February of 2020, but that was only because we see the pandemic shock coming. The risk we have right now is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. World food prices are going to hit a high last seen since World War II. Oil, we already know oil and energy prices through central banks around the globe, not just the Federal Reserve, are going to have to figure out how to steer through that. And they're going to try to raise interest rates to try to quell demand get in the face of these high prices. But the bottom line is there's going to be less food. There's going to be less oil available. And that means that we're going to be able to produce less. And that's where the risk of a recession lies. I think that in any kind of recession, it's a really good opportunity for people to gain the skills they need to land on their feet as the economy starts to recover. So I would personally like to see workforce development at sort of warp speed during any kind of recession, bringing in as many people as possible, trying to think about what kind of careers to train them for, and making sure they have a plan to be able to enter the labor market as it gets tighter. This would be, look, it's hard to find any silver lining to a recession, but one of the things I said at the end was we do have a shortage of skills. There were not enough people who were trained in 2020 and 2021 in a lot of the kinds of, things like medical technician, dental hygienist, dental assistant, these kinds of jobs, home healthcare aides. These are the things that we need more of. And I hope that you're prepared to train lots of people. The question for you will be, will lots of people come for these training programs? If there's a recession, the answer is a definite yes. So be prepared, make sure you have the funding lined up. And I think that's the
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Everyone, please rise. Betsy Stevenson. Well, thank you for staying until the end. Before we conclude this year's annual summit, I do want to point out just a couple of housekeeping items that you all should have received already a link for the survey. Please complete the survey. We look at constant improvement cycles. We always want to be not only changing for the better tech wise, but also content wise, and making sure that we are keeping the topics that we discuss at our summits current and relevant. So please help us with that. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, and what you would like to see for next year as well. Also, if you haven't already, we're having a fire sale in the back table there of swag, and literally it's a fire sale, because if I have to take any of it back, I get fired. So please take some with you, please, and thank you for your friends that weren't here. Dr. Julian, is there anything that we're missing? All right, well, if I may, please give yourselves a big round of a hand. Please give our hotel staff a round of applause, and also our teammates at ICSPS. And thank you for all that you do. Please drive home safely.
Thank you.